So Mike Ennis is the director of our Center for Transportation, and he's going to kick off the policy part of the program. There's also, we have lots of fruit and muffins and water and coffee, so feel free to jump up and help yourself. Mike.
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, my name is Mike Ennis. I'm the Transportation Director at WPC. I want to keep this as informal as possible. We're going to go through a lot of numbers and stats and policy positions, so if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt and just raise your hand and ask them. I think that will spur me into more things than I would talk about than what I can remember on my own. So, in the back you're going to find this document. I don't think it's in your folders, but we've produced this about a year ago called our 5 Principles to a Responsible Transportation Policy. And in it you're going to find just what the title says, our 5 beliefs in how transportation policy should be in Washington State. Now, a few months ago, I was contacted by a state legislator from the state of Arkansas, and he asked if he could use some of our principles and some of the poll questions that we have listed in here on his website. He manages a blog, I guess, in Arkansas, and he wanted to ask the question to his visitor on his blog, the same question that we asked in our poll, and we'll go over some of those results in a minute. He wanted to ask, as you think about the government's role in transportation, how important to you is reducing congestion? He wanted to ask that question to his visitors. And we asked the same question statewide, and not surprisingly, in our state, 2/3 of voters said that congestion relief is very or extremely important to them. So I said, sure, go ahead. So he put this question on his blog, and he got his results, and he called me up. And he said, Mike, you're not going to believe this. And I said, okay, what's going on? He said, well, not surprisingly, like your results, 2/3 of the people said that they think congestion relief is important to them. However, there were half a dozen or so respondents who said that it was not important to them at all. And I said, well, that's kind of surprising. And he said, no, just wait. See, as the manager of this blog, he's able to look at who visits and who votes on and who comes to his website. And he was able to see that in this case. And he said that all 5 or 6 votes, all 5 or 6 people who said that they did not think congestion relief was important to them, came from computers owned by the Washington State Department of Transportation. All of them. So that's kind of what we're up against here when we talk about our 5 principles. We look at everything through the lens of congestion relief. Tying, spending your transportation taxes to certain performance measures. One of them, the most important in our region at least, is congestion relief. Right now, the state's definition, the state's goal, as they think it relates to congestion relief, and we'll talk about it here in a few minutes, is to improve the predictable movement of people and goods. That doesn't get to congestion relief at all, and I'll tell you why when we get to it here in a minute. But let's talk about some of our poll information. So we've done 2 statewide polls over the last 2 or 3 years, and we'll have results on both of them. And I want to profile 5 or 6 questions here and how respondents answer, because this, I think, kind of plays into how we came up with our 5 principles. This just goes over the methodology we used in the poll. It was a statewide poll. First question we asked was, when spending your transportation taxes, do you think the state government's first priority should be reduce traffic congestion or to fund other transportation needs? You can see the dark blue bar is our first poll that we did in 2007. The gray bar is our updated poll that we did in 2009. We'll do it again probably at the end of this year. But not surprisingly, half or just above half thought reducing traffic congestion was important to them. Some of the cross-tabulation data I think is very interesting. It's broken down by region and party affiliation. Those in Seattle and non-Seattle King County believe that reducing traffic congestion is important to them over funding other transportation needs. What's interesting is this column here. This column represents the difference between these two. Another way to look at it is how strongly that particular subgroup believes in their answer. So 0 to 10% is somewhat strong. 10 to 20% is very strong, and anything over 20% means they believe in their answer extremely. They're very committed to that answer. And here we see in Seattle non-King County, 58% think we should reduce congestion over funding other transportation needs, and they're very strongly committed to that answer, 25%. And then party affiliation is also interesting. Republicans and independents strongly believe that we should reduce congestion, and those who identified themselves as Democrats were somewhat committed to funding other transportation needs over congestion. Yeah.
Quick question, is that exactly the way the question was asked?
Yes.
Or were people presented options as to what other needs might be?
No, this is the question verbatim. Now, remember these here. There's another question that we've asked that the results were kind of surprising. I'm going to refer back to this. Remember the party affiliation and how they answered this question here. Okay. Next question. As you think about the government's role in transportation, how important to you personally is reducing congestion? Not surprisingly, as we talked about, 2/3 believe that it's extremely important to them. Just some of the cross-tabulation data for that question related to different areas. You can see people in the west side of the state think congestion relief is more important than those on the east side of the state, though they're still over 50%. How would you rate state government's performance on relieving traffic congestion? Not surprisingly, over 2/3 of voters rate the state's performance at reducing congestion at poor or extremely poor. Would you vote for or against a major tax increase if you were convinced the plan would actually reduce traffic congestion in your area? Over 50% would support a major tax increase if they were convinced that it would reduce congestion. We know taxpayers have a tolerance for higher taxes as long as there is at least a perception that the tax increase will deliver something tangible, in this case congestion relief. Cross-tabulation data on the tax question. Seattle and Mountain County, very committed to that answer. Why? They're the ones who commute from the suburbs into downtown Seattle. Downtown Seattle, in a recent study, is the most congested city in America. So it's not surprising that these people care most about reducing congestion, and they will support a tax increase as long as there's at least a perception.
Question?
Yes.
In the previous slide, you said most would go for a major tax increase. What was, or what is the definition of a major tax increase?
We didn't clarify. So this is the question that we asked, and this is how respondents answered that question. So it was left up to the respondent.
In some minds, it could be 10 cents a gallon.
Correct.
In others, it could be $5 a gallon.
Correct. We did not clarify. Now what's interesting here, party affiliation. Republicans somewhat committed to opposing a tax increase. Democrats very strongly committed to a tax increase. Okay? But here, those who identified themselves as Democrats don't think we should fund things related to congestion relief, unless it's tied to a tax increase.
Everything goes better with tax increases.
Okay, now this is probably, I think, the most telling question that we asked. I call this our Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones question. This kind of defines the two competing philosophies in transportation policy, not only in Washington State, but more generally across the country. Mr. Smith believes state governments should try to get people out of their cars, and that we need to focus on tax dollars on public transit, not building more highways. Mr. Jones, on the other hand, believes state government should focus on fixing traffic congestion. Congestion relief will help commuters get to work, and so on. Our results statewide, 51% in our latest poll sided with Mr. Jones, 39% in the first year and 42% in the second year sided with Mr. Smith. Cross-tabulation data mirrors a lot of what we've seen in the other countries on how important congestion relief is to voters. Again, party affiliation I think is very telling on that question. Republicans and independents with Mr. Jones. Those who identify themselves as Democrats very strongly committed to Mr. Smith. Yeah.
This is from a sample of 500, population 500. How did you come up with that 500? How did you decide who to contact?
It was a random sample. We contracted with a professional pollster who was able to do that.
Registered voters, do we know any information about?
They are registered voters statewide. We didn't do the polling ourselves. We relied on the pollster to do it for us.
Are these voters or citizens?
They are voters. Well, both. Allegedly both. They're supposed to be voters. So, we use what we know about free market principles and our polling data to come up with our 5 principles. And you'll find them explained more in detail in this document here, and we'll go over them now. So the first one is time spending to performance measures. 2 years ago, Senate Bill 5412 passed. The state used to have very specific performance measures or conditions from which transportation taxes were spent. And this was some of them. Traffic congestion on urban state highways shall be significantly reduced and be no worse than the national mean. Delay per driver shall be significantly reduced and no worse than the national mean. All that language was stricken in Senate Bill 5412, which passed. It was replaced by these 5 broad goals, which I'll go over here. These are them here. Preservation, safety, mobility, environment, and stewardship. So transportation taxes should be tied, according to the state, to these 5 goals. Incidentally, they're very similar to the 5 goals found in the Washington Transportation Plan. Both of them contain this phrase, mobility. In both plans, it is defined this way: to improve the predictable movement of goods and people throughout Washington state. Now, to me, this sentence means that if your commute is congested every single day, as long as it's predictable, the state is meeting their goal. To me, that is a mistake. I think you should return to explicitly saying that congestion relief is a goal. It should be tied to spending transportation taxes. Incidentally, these are the 5 goals that the state of Texas uses. Number 1 is reducing congestion. They are explicitly prioritizing congestion relief as a performance measure in spending their transportation taxes. We think we should do the same thing here in Washington state. Second principle is respect people's freedom of mobility. So a few years ago, when we had the RTID Sound Transit proposition, it was the one that was rejected by voters in 2007. I was invited to a panel at Seattle University, and I was on a panel with 2 or 3 other environmental groups. And the question was posed to us: how do you define the relationship between land use and transportation policy? And the guy from the Sierra Club who was sitting next to me said he has a utopian vision. Anytime somebody uses the word utopian vision as they're talking about transportation or land use policy, I get a little nervous, especially coming from a free market think tank. But he said he had a utopian vision in how the government should, he didn't use the word force, but I'll use the word force because that's essentially what he meant, to force people to live and work in certain areas, along certain corridors. Now when the question came to me, I said, well, I don't think the government has a role in defining or forcing people where they live or work. Afterwards, a university law school professor came up to me and he said, just where do you get this concept of people choosing on their own where they live or work? Now typically I'm not real good at answering these kind of questions on the fly. But in this case it was very easy for me. I said, well, professor, very simple, it's called freedom. People have the freedom, or should have the freedom, to choose where they live and work on their own. And this was his answer to me. That's preposterous. Doesn't sound like a place I want to live. It's anarchy. This was a Seattle University law professor. And this is what he said to me. Hang on a second. Now what he's referring to with anarchy is no government intervention at all. And that's not what we believe. Government does have a role in transportation policy and in land use policy. The way I look at it is they're bookends. The space in between the bookends is where society operates. We argue that that space should be very large. I think he would argue that that space should be very narrow, and the government has a greater role in defining what you do. We, on the other hand, disagree. And I think he missed my point a little bit. Yeah.
I believe what the professor is referring to is Agenda 21, which many cities and municipalities, counties around the country have already adopted.
What is Agenda 21?
Agenda 21's mission is to create buffer zones, the wilderness areas, so that people are limited in their transportation ability to have to take rapid transit systems rather than ride freeways and whatnot for environmental purposes.
Right.
And to stack people deep in urban areas in condos like they're building now.
Right.
What was this professor's name?
I don't remember what
Because I went to SU and I
he was,
wanted
I don't know,
somebody.
he was a law school professor. He didn't introduce himself to me. I don't know who his name was. Principle number 3 is investing resources based on demand. So typically the way we invest transportation resources on the transit side is build it and they will come. However, what happens when you have that philosophy of spending, you have a performance gap between your costs and benefits. We argue that that space should be very small. Now this doesn't mean that roads are good, doesn't mean that transit is bad, or vice versa. All this means is that if you invest on the concept of build it and they will come, you will have a large gap between cost and benefits. Your mode share, your fare box recovery, and your ridership will be low. Okay? Supply is a function of demand. Boeing does not build 300 airplanes knowing they're only going to sell 100. Likewise, we should invest proportionally based on demand. Number 4 is improving freight mobility. Dedicated freight corridors, dedicated freight account with existing revenues, and expanding rail corridors to allow greater choice for private companies to shift freight distribution networks from the road system to the rail system, which is the most efficient way to distribute medium and long distance freight or goods. Number 5, utilizing all financial tools available, including public-private partnerships. We know that there is a lot of available financial resources in the private sector, and the public sector should be willing and able to leverage those dollars. So we had a group of developers in the Pierce County area who wanted to contribute their own money to a transportation project, a road project in Pierce County. It was part of the RTID package, and there were some deliberations about that particular project falling off the list. So these developers got together and they said, well, we want to pay for the project. Now this is not new in transportation policy. We've seen these partnerships all over the country. Some of them have worked, some of them have not. I think we've learned from the mistakes of the ones that have not worked, and we've improved the ones that have worked. What was interesting about this is they did not want any concessions. They did not want to own the project. They didn't want to toll it. They didn't want to have any control of it at all. All they wanted to do was pay for it. Okay? That's what's interesting about this. They wanted to deliver the money to the county and say, you build it, we don't want to have any control over it. And the county said no. The reason the county said no is because of transportation impact fees. These developers wanted to use the money that they were contributing to this project to count for their transportation impact fees that they were obligated to pay for building some projects that they had in the area. The county said no. We want to be in control of how those dollars are spent, not you. So they were not allowed to build the project. RTID failed, and I think the project has not been built yet. But allowing the private sector to do things like this, I think, is a win-win for everyone. Leveraging those private dollars. So those are our 5 principles. Are there any questions on those?
Could you repeat the 5 again, quick? Thank you.
Time spending to performance measures, respecting people's freedom of mobility, investing resources based on demand, freight mobility, and public-private partnerships. All of those are explained in more detail here.
Not all of us got that.
Yeah.
No, they did.
No, we didn't all get it.
Didn't get it back here.
If you didn't get it, make sure that I get your business card and I'll mail you a copy.
There you go. So the next thing I want to talk about quickly is a public transit mode, which, if you look at the numbers, is the most efficient inner city transit mode that we have. It's called Vanpools. There are about 20 Vanpool programs across the country. Now, when you think about inner city transit, let's define what inner city transit is. It's connecting cities over long geographic distances. Okay? Right now, we're doing that. We do have some Vanpool programs, but right now we're doing it predominantly through express bus systems, Sound Transit Express buses. The Sounder commuter rail is another example, and light rail. So connecting cities over long geographical distances with those modes. What we find, however, is that when you look at the performance of them, how much we're spending compared to who's riding them and how far they go, we find some very interesting details. Sounder commuter rail. Operating in capital costs $5.39 per passenger mile traveled. Sound Transit Express buses, $1.70 per passenger mile. More efficient than the commuter rail, for sure. Light rail. Now, by the time we did this study, our light rail system had not been open long enough for us to have any reliable data. So what we did is we looked at 3 existing systems on the West Coast: San Jose, Los Angeles, and Portland. Portland is generally regarded as the most efficient. I would still argue it is inefficient, but it is the most efficient light rail program of all of them. San Jose is generally regarded as the least efficient across the country, and Los Angeles is just simply large, and it balances out the average. Light rail is about $1.15 per passenger mile, so more efficient than these two. Now, the 6 regional bus agencies, and I should clarify, there are 6 programs, Vanpool programs, in the Puget Sound region. They're all managed by county transit agencies. If you look at the same 6 bus agencies, they're at 85 cents per mile. Now, these two are not comparable. Okay? They don't serve the same market. Intercity transit is typically geared toward commuters. So while I just kind of just threw this up here so you have some context of how buses compare to Vanpools, but it's not really relevant between the two. What is relevant is comparing Vanpools to these others. Vanpools, 20 cents per passenger mile. Compare that to the Sounder commuter rail, $5.39. King County has the largest Vanpool, the largest public Vanpool program in the country. What we argue, based on these results, is that you should saturate the Vanpool market. State DOT did a study and found that there is a large undeveloped market for Vanpools in the Puget Sound area. You should saturate that market before you expand any other intercity transit mode, including buses or rail. Then users pay. On average, the 6 regional Vanpool agencies, users covered 66% of operating costs. Taxpayers cover the remaining 34%. In King County, which is the largest, it influences these results the most, the fare box recovery is over 80%. That's exactly opposite of what you see with other transit agencies, or other transit modes. Taxpayers cover 80% while users only cover 20%. You would only need to raise fares for Vanpools by about 50% to make them completely self-sufficient. About $1 a trip. Every other state allows or possesses private Vanpool operators. Washington doesn't. Now, we don't prohibit private operators from locating here like we do with bus operators. Private Vanpool operators do not locate here because of this subsidy, because of this remaining 34%. They cannot compete with that. So one of our recommendations is to make the Vanpool program completely self-sufficient, make users pay 100%, and make the playing field level so private operators do have the opportunity to come in here. You gotta remember what our goal is. It's moving people from point A to point B as cheaply as possible. Vanpool programs do that. Subsidies. Public subsidy required for boarding Sounder commuter rail. Every time somebody gets on that Sounder, you and I pay $10.66 per person. For Vanpools, it's $1.26. Another way to look at this, you'd only have to raise Vanpool fares by $1.26 to make them self-sufficient. To make Sounder commuter rail self-sufficient, you'd have to raise fares by $10.66, which is more than double. So our recommendations with Vanpools is you should saturate that market before expanding any other intercity transit mode.
Mike, Mike, about 2 minutes.
Okay.
And just a question on comparing those two. The Vanpools are already running on highways and freeways and roads that are already constructed. Are those costs added into that?
They're not.
Okay,
In the same way that you don't count highways and roads when you're calculating the cost for operating buses either.
Okay, I understand, but when you do the train, now, I'm sure you've added in all the construction costs. but-
On the capital side, we do include the conveyance cost for rail, because the rail is built specifically for that system. You don't build the road specifically for Vanpools.
I understand.
They're just kind of piggybacking on for other intents and purposes.
Yeah. Okay.
Same reason why you don't count them on the transit, on the bus side either. So that's my presentation. Dan, do we have time for questions or?
Well, I would just do two real quick ones.
Okay, let's do these two here. Yeah.
Do you have anything on positions on alternative energy, specific alternative energy methods?
We don't in the Transportation Center. The Environmental Center may be able to answer that question a little bit better for you, but we don't.
A number of studies have been done on the 6 transit agencies we have in the 3-county region. Every study that I've ever read said we should consolidate. It just seems terribly inefficient to have 6 agencies doing the same thing. There's a lot of redundancy there. Do you have a position?
We don't have a position on whether they should consolidate or not. However, there is a lot of bureaucracy, there are a lot of layers of government, and they all have competing interests, competing turfs. Sound Transit, on some levels, competes with King County Metro.
Right.
And King County Metro, quite frankly, kind of agrees with them and allows them to steal a lot of their riders from their bus system to a light rail system. They're starting to move towards creating a bus system that feeds only the light rail system. A lot of argument on whether that's the role of a transit agency when there's a competing transit agency next to them. But consolidating does make some sense. There's a lot of argument on the other side of it as well. We don't have a position on it.
Okay.
Some things you want to watch for in the legislature that I want to wrap up real quick. Tolling, we argue that the most important issue around tolling is constitutionally protecting those revenues. Just like the 18th Amendment protects gas tax revenues, we should constitutionally protect toll revenues. Those who pay the toll should be the only ones who benefit from it. Secondly is repealing the VMT reduction targets. The state wants to reduce how much people drive by 18% by 2020. There are a lot of negative things that are a lot of consequences from that, one of which is it reduces gas tax revenues, so the nickel and TPA gas tax projects we estimate would reduce gas tax revenue if the state was able to meet their reduction targets by about 10%, about $1.5 billion. Jeopardizes all of those projects. It also means that you probably can't bond using toll revenue. You will not have investors back toll revenue when there is a law in the books that says you're going to reduce how much people drive, which directly affects toll revenue, that toll revenue stream. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find backers of bonds on toll revenue. Those are a couple things that we'll be looking at during the legislative session.
I'll take Jan's question real quick.
Yeah.
Are you doing anything with regard to legislation on the tolls for the?
We'll probably do a legislative memo. We've done a tolling policy a couple of years ago. I think we'll update it again this year.
Good.
Because there's going to be a lot more discussion about tolls, especially as it relates to 405 as well.
Yeah, and Mike did a study on the 405 issue just this year.
We did. So there was a bill last year, or this year, that would toll 405 from Bellevue to the north end. And if you look at the DOT studies, they don't compare the tolling scenarios to the 405 master plan. Now, I've never seen a transportation study where they don't make a comparison to a no-build option, but that's exactly what DOT did. We argue that you should compare the performance of the master plan. So go ahead and add the 2 additional lanes, which the master plan calls for and DOT is now building. Look at the performance, look at the traffic counts with that master plan once it's built out, and compare them to a tolled scenario before you toll 405, and that simply hasn't happened yet. And we'll do another analysis on that.
Well, they're dumping all the funds together. I mean, that's very concerning.
Right, but the entire plan for 405 is to toll it from the north end of 405, connect 405 to 167, and toll it to its eventual connection with I-5 in the south end. What we say is, we support hot lanes. We like the hot lane concept, but not when it takes a general purpose lane, because the performance of the hot lanes do not match the performance of a general purpose lane. And that's what they're doing, or that's what they're proposing to do with the 405 tolling study.
Okay, great, thanks, Mike.